I mentioned in the last video that I had some larger capacity memory cards arriving soon, and they turned out to be super interesting, so I decided to make another video focused on them and their unique behaviors. The first thing to keep in mind here is that I don't have a large variety of memory cards to test. There may be other knockoff memory cards out there that behave in different ways. You may buy a 32MB memory card that behaves differently to the one I have. In general, you shouldn't notice anything different about these memory cards, and can just use them as you would any official card, but there may be a trap or two to look out for. It is also possible that cards could be sold with a file system set up to claim a capacity that they don't actually have, and start corrupting themselves after you cross the real capacity. There is no guarantee when you buy knockoffs, so do so at your own risk. The very first question I had that needs to be answered is whether the cards work properly with the PlayStation 2. And at the least from my testing, so far the answer is yes. And they even seem to have their advertised capacities. They have their quirks though. From the outside, these memory cards are pretty good facsimile of the official PlayStation 2 memory cards, minus all the Sony and PlayStation branding of course. They even have the same lift and slide design for removing the outer casing. On the inside, there is one glaring difference, the blob top chip that replaces the Sony-made memory controller. Other than that, these memory card PCBs are single-sided, and there are two distinct revisions here, with the 32 and 64MB cards sharing the same PCB revision, while the 128MB card has another revision that looks to support different package size NAND chips. I found signs of there being different revision memory controller chips present in these memory cards as well, but I'll come back to that later on. I was able to find the datasheets for all the NAND chips in these cards, and they had their standard 512 plus 16-byte page sizes, with the non-standard 32-page block size, which, as I mentioned in the previous video, is probably a result of higher NAND density technology. This of course means that my routines do not support these memory cards yet, but I will work on that in some other time. And that is all I really have to say about the hardware. I can't inspect the blob chip without likely destroying the memory card, and I have no experience removing that stuff. Perhaps I'll sacrifice the memory card at a later date, but not today. From looking at the file system, it seems to me that these were not formatted on a PlayStation 2 console, and I can say that definitively with two of the memory cards, but again that will be later. Everything in the super block looks normal, except that in the 64MB memory card, we have two clusters for the indirect fact table, and the 128 memory card has 4. On the 32 and 64MB cards, the pages that are after the super block, but before the start of the indirect fact table, all the bytes are FF. This is unusual because if a card is formatted on the console, every page should have its 12 CRC bytes and 4 padding bytes. And we can see that on the 128MB card that these are present. So this is one hint that these cards were not formatted by a console. The indirect fact table on the 32MB card takes up a full page of the first cluster of the table, and the fact table itself starts in cluster number 9 down here. This is normal. On the 64MB memory card, the indirect fact table takes up the full cluster 8 with references to the clusters that make up the fact table, but cluster 9 is also reserved for the indirect fact table. So the fact table itself starts from cluster number 10. This is kind of odd because there are no references in cluster 9. So cluster 9 is not needed for the indirect fact table at all. And now you can probably guess what is going on with the 128MB card. The indirect fact table reserves 4 clusters, but at twice the size of the 64MB card, it needs twice the indirect fact table references, which means 2 clusters. And we can see that it only uses these 2 clusters. But it still has 4 clusters reserved. So there are 2 unused clusters before the start of the fact table itself. Now the 128MB card can be formatted by the console. I wiped the file system and reformatted it in the PS2 browser, and when I did that, the console only used 2 clusters for the indirect fact table. So that's a big giveaway that even the 128MB card is not formatted on a console. For the 32 and 64MB cards, there is an issue if you try to wipe and reformat them. If you run the get specs command, both memory cards return that the memory card is about 16,000 pages in length, which is about 8 megabytes. In comparison, the 128MB card returns 262,000 pages in length, which is correct for 128 megabytes. So that's why the 128MB card formats just fine. But because get specs tells the console that the 32 and 64MB cards are 8 megabytes, that is how the console will format them. If you wipe your 32 or 64MB card, or the super block gets corrupted, reformatting it will lose access to most of the space on the card. I did hack together a program to force a 32MB file system back onto the memory card, and I'm planning to put that functionality, perhaps a force install or a NAND size detection that doesn't rely on GetSpecs, into Memory Card Tools program at some point, but that's for another time. But there is actually another issue. If we remember on the official memory cards, the block size was 16 pages, or 8 clusters, and the indirect fact table started in cluster 8, or the second block of the NAND, with the fact table starting in cluster 9. This was good because whenever you update part of the fact table, you have to erase and reprogram the entire block, which slowly wears out the NAND in that location. But on these memory cards, the indirect fact table is still in cluster 8, and the second block starts at cluster 16. None of these memory cards put the indirect or fact tables at the beginning of the second block. So whenever you update part of the fact table that was within the first block, you have to erase that block, including the super block, and reprogram it, which will slowly wear it out. Now, once you have made some save files on the card and allocated the first block area of the fact table, you probably won't update that part of the fact table much, unless you delete those saves and make new saves to the memory card. But if you are regularly deleting saves and making new saves, or otherwise cycling a lot of data on it, you may start wearing out that block faster than you would on a regular memory card. I do plan for my tool to move the fact table outside the first block, so that won't be an issue. My 32MB card already has it like that, but that's for another time. As far as I've seen, the low-level communications with the memory cards are all as normal, aside from GetSpecs returning the wrong capacity on the 32 and 64MB cards. But there are also signs that the controller chips were reverse engineered based on the decompilation of the MICMAN and SecureMan modules. When it comes to writing to the memory card, you can do a continuous write up to a page boundary, just the same as on the official memory cards. But when it comes to continuous reading, there are differences. The 64MB card can only read up to a block boundary, but the 32MB card can continuously read up to 2 blocks, and the 128MB card can continuously read up to at least 8 blocks. At first I was thinking it was a difference in the memory controllers, but now I think the difference comes from the different NAND manufacturers. The 32 and 128MB cards have NAND by SK Hynix, while the 64MB is Samsung, which is one of the main suppliers for the official cards. The difference in read boundaries doesn't make much difference. You can get marginally better continuous read speeds if you don't have to readdress as often, but to take advantage of that, you need to be able to detect the capability of the cards first. The MICMAN module only does continuous reads up to page boundaries, so it doesn't affect how programs and games using the official modules or SDK at all. The reason I think the controller chips were reverse engineered off the PS2 SDK comes down to the need to run the probe command before the beginning of the auth process on these memory cards. If you remember my last video, I said that I thought the probe command was somewhat useless because you don't get any useful information back, and you can use other commands to check if a card was present and ready to be accessed. However, in the PS2 SDK, many functions will first try to detect the memory card, and it does this with a probe command, here. And if that probe is not successful, then an auth is initiated. Now that sounds backwards. If the probe is unsuccessful, the auth process is started, but the probe command only works when a card has been authed successfully. So if the probe command is successful, you know the card is there and ready to be used. If it is unsuccessful, a card might be there, so you try to auth to find it. On the official memory cards, the initial probe command is not required to start the auth process, but it is required on these knockoff cards, and that is why I think they are reverse engineered from the SDK or decompilation. They work with the official modules, but they are not identical to the function of the official controllers. But the 128MB card is crazy, and to understand why, I'm going to have to give a brief overview of how authenticating memory cards work. Now you'd probably think you have your memory card that's connected to the Mechicon, that's connected to the SIO2, that you then write code. Right? So you have the Mechicon that authenticates the memory card and arbitrates communication with the code or the IP module, right, program. However, the way it actually works is that you have your memory card connected to the SIO2 interface, then you have your code that's running, and the Mechicon's off somewhere else. So your code is arbitrating the authentication between the Mechicon and the memory card. The best way to think about it is that your memory card is locked, and it will give the console a code word. And if it responds with the correct answer, then the memory card will unlock itself, and you can start accessing it. However, if the memory card gets an incorrect answer, it is supposed to refuse to proceed, so that you have to begin the process again from the beginning. This is not the case on this 128MB card. If it gets an incorrect answer, it will respond with an error, and then you can just continue the auth process. In fact, you don't have to do the auth process at all. You can just send the auth reset command, and then the final message in the auth process, hex 14, and it will unlock itself. This does not work on the 32 and 64MB cards, which suggests a considerably different memory control on them. They do all respond correctly to the correct auth process, which allows them all to be used with the PlayStation 2 with official software, but it's incredibly interesting how many divergences there are from the official memory cards. It could be that the PCB revisions are indicative of what type of memory controller is present, but I only have a few knockoff cards available, so I can't draw definitive conclusions about that. One thing you might notice missing from this analysis is a look at the Magic Gate capabilities to encrypt and decrypt data on the memory cards. This is functionality that I have not personally looked into yet in any capacity, even on the official memory cards. From the successful key exchange with the Mechicon, I would say that it looks likely that encryption and decryption can be handled as expected, but I can't guarantee it. There might be something interesting in how these cards handle that, but if I find it, maybe that could be a topic for another video. But for now, I'm going to end this video here. Thanks for watching.